Well, Michelle, we've been working in employment services collectively for years and years and years, and we've interacted with so many clients over time. You know, one thing that we're not often talking, or at least I'm not talking about with clients, is my own personal experiences in the world of employment. And I just think it would be nice to have a conversation today about some of our experiences with coworkers, with managers, interviewing people, being interviewed, and kind of any lessons that we might have learned along the way.
Some big lessons that I've learned along the way. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes when we talk to our clients, they might look at us like we haven't been through some of the things they've been through, and we absolutely have. And a lot of things we're encouraging them to do are things that we've learned sometimes the hard way.
Yeah, and you kind of, the more you think about it, the more the clients actually have models or experiences that if they looked at them a little bit differently, it might really inform best practices for them in the workplace, you know, best practices in job interviews and how to make bosses happy, right? Because like it or not, you know, most jobs do revolve around pleasing your boss. You know, I just kind of encourage a lot of the people that we work for to think a little bit more objectively about some of their past experiences. And I honestly think that one of the most instructive things that we could think about is who we've worked with in the past that's inspired us or that's kind of acted like the perfect coworker or the perfect employee. So I'm just kind of curious, like, who's the best coworker you've ever had besides me?
I would say the best coworker I've had was a woman I worked with when I worked at the deaf school. I was still kind of early in my career, and I had never worked formally in the deaf community before. And I just remember when I first got there, it was like open arms, like, come on in, made a hilarious first impression. Just somebody who was like, I got you, Michelle, right? I know you're new, I know you're nervous, but I've been here for years, and I'm, you know, an open book. Anything you need to ask, don't be shy to ask. Sometimes when you're new, that's the reluctance. You want to seem like you know what you're doing, but you really don't. And so I just loved her, the way that she worked with the youth. And so I just learned that I'm going to watch this woman close. And what I saw is that she was really invested in the clients. And in social services, that's everything, right? She listened to the kids when they had frustrations. She remembered important details so that they knew that she was somebody who really cared about that, and just infused a ton of fun. She was probably one of the hardest working people I'd ever worked with, but it was like this really balance of like work hard, play hard. She'd take stuff home, not because she had to, because she was excited about it. She'd come back and go, I got a great idea what we should do for the boys before they come back from school tomorrow. And it just really was contagious. It got everybody super excited. And I still, to this day, when I sort of think about the type of person I want to be at work, her face always comes to mind.
Yeah, you know, a lot of similar ideas kind of spring into my mind when I think about the best person that I ever worked with. And it was early in my journalism career, and there was a guy working at the local TV station at the time who was kind of a leader in a sense and really kind of treated me as an equal, really wanted to share all his knowledge with me and was really encouraging along the way. But one of the things that I'll always kind of remember and that I've tried to emulate ever since, and this is like 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, is that he was the same person every single day. And it didn't matter what was going on in his personal life. To be honest, I had no idea what was going on in his personal life. He was just this work guy who was always ready to crack a joke, always ready to have a smile, and no matter what was going on, he was the exact same person. And I've tried to kind of be that since then, is that, you know, if I've got stuff personal going on at home, I'm not going to bring it to work. I'm still going to be the same person I was yesterday. And tomorrow I'll be the same person that I was today. And another thing that kind of struck me about him too is how he was completely immune to office politics. And how, you know, he essentially just transcended it. It was like he was kind of floating above everything and just kind of bringing humor and joy to every single day. So he's the best. With every best, you got a little bit of a binary going on. There's also some worst coworkers. You got anyone in your mind?
I know exactly who my worst coworker was, and it was a woman that we shared an office, we had the same job, and when I first met her, you know, you talk about first impressions, and my first impression was like, ooh, be cautious around this woman. She was the opposite of what you just talked about. You know, she brought everything personal into the workplace and wanted to talk about it even when there was work to be done. It was like, I'm busy, I'm new, I'm trying to, you know, learn and impress. And so very quickly I just was cautious. And she was a really passive aggressive woman. So she wanted to be very nice, but she had a certain ways that she wanted things done. I remember there was a night we'd run these facilitated groups with women and kids, and her co-facilitator would run the groups long, and she didn't like it. But rather than talk to her coworker and say, listen, you know, it's really important to me to finish on time, et cetera, what she did was she snuck in the room and changed the clock to a later time. So the coworker thought that, you know, she was, you know, going long, but finished on time. And when she told me, I thought she was kidding. I was like, yeah, that'd be hilarious. And she's like, no, that's what I did. I'm gonna go in every week and change the clock. And I just couldn't believe it.
I can't believe that either.
And then so I couldn't, then it was just like the trust was not there. And to me, you know, I can put up with the ebbs and flows of a lot of character flaws with my colleagues and coworkers, but in that moment I was just like, okay, my first instinct was right. This woman can't be trusted. And in the end, she got fired for theft. So it was just, you know, really a good lesson. Again, who am I emulating and who do I like, you know, what was kind of worst case scenario? What about you, Mike? You probably got a couple.
Well, it's not like that. Like, I don't have anybody who's manipulating the fourth dimension in daylight time. But I was a teacher for a while in a unionized environment, and there was a particular individual I worked with whose instincts were always negative. That whenever any new protocol or mandate would come down, it wouldn't be, how can we do this, or how can we best adapt to this? It would be, how can I destroy this and make sure that I screw it up so bad that we don't have to do it anymore? Oh. And it was difficult and frustrating because every day it would start with this person and, you know, coming into my classroom and ranting and raving about this thing and how we're not going to do this thing and all the reasons why whatever mandate that came down from the principal was a negative, and there just wasn't an ounce of positivity in her. And it was also a unionized environment, and certainly when you're in a unionized environment, there's parameters of things you can get away with and can't, perhaps not, and she certainly push those to what I saw as the limits on a weekly basis as far as time away from work, levels of responsibility, and would always be the first person to drop that dreaded line, not my job, right? And like this would even like a mess on the floor. Come on, just wipe it up. Yeah. Not my job. Like, again, just like the person who had the positive influence on me, I've taken a lot of lessons from that person on how not to behave in the workplace, because you know, this negative energy can snowball, right? Yes. And you don't want to be, you know, just focus on the job, right? Or focus on the work, not the job, is what we're often saying. And she was so focused on the job aspects and the little kind of ticky-tacky arguments with management that it was just a negative experience, we'll say, on the whole. Yeah.
I'm glad you have better coworkers now, Mike.
Yeah, so they say. Some suggest it. But yeah, Michelle, you are a great coworker. And you know, both of us have had interesting work histories. Yep. You know, certainly working at Pathways is neither of our first job, and we've both got a little bit of management experience behind us. Mm-hmm. So I think often that we're in a pretty good position to advise clients on interview best practices because, you know, we've interviewed probably thousands of people between us, and we've also probably been interviewed dozens upon dozens of times. So, you know, I'm kind of curious if you can flash back to all the people you've interviewed. Who was the best? Who was the worst? Well, start me with the best. Tell me a story. Make me bring tears to my eyes if you can.
One of my best staff that I hired, I had put out a posting looking for somebody to run our, what we called Studio 2. And it was film, photography, and using kind of multimedia to engage youth around mental health and talking about violence prevention. And because all of our work was done with youth, we were really about youth engagement, I was looking for a staff that, you know, not just had the skill set, but had the people skills as well, and particular youth skills. So I invited young people to actually co-interview with me, which was something that we had never really done before, but I thought training and teaching them how to do that would actually be beneficial to them and help make sure I hired the right person. So we had probably 6 interviews set up. Everybody came in, did a good job. I mean, there was no, like, you know, they're all relatively equal. And then this man came in and immediately he just started talking to young people and making them laugh. And he told them a few stories. And then he said, you know what, I could sit here and tell you what I do, but I'd rather show you what I do. And he opens up his laptop and he pulls out all of these videos and the different photography projects and some ideas that he's kind of thinking about. And then he starts asking them what they think. And it didn't even feel like an interview. Like, it turned into this, like, they were sparked. They were like, oh, that's so cool. And how did you do that? And so literally, as he's showing them his portfolio, he's teaching these young people media skills. And in that moment, in my mind, I was like, this is the guy. Right? And then, of course, he left, and the youth were like, if you don't hire him, we're not sticking around. And so just sort of head and shoulders showing that storytelling and using examples and kind of evidence of what you've done can really make a huge difference in interviews. So that was my best interview. What about yours? Yeah.
Well, I remember I was the advertising manager of a weekly magazine, and I was hiring an ad salesperson.
Yeah.
And, you know, selling advertising is a very difficult thing to do. It's abstract. You're not really selling anything. You know, you're kind of selling the promise that something might happen, and if something does happen, we'll take credit for it. But, you know, it's impossible to quantify the results of advertising, so it's a very difficult thing to sell. And I remember a guy came in, and it was a very short interview. He said to me, I'm curious what your ad rates are. And I showed them, you know, the chart and how it all worked, and he looked at it super carefully, and I could tell he was really, really thinking about it. And he looked at me and he said, oh, I can sell this. And I thought, you're hired. Yeah. That was it. I thought the line, I can sell this, kind of encapsulated everything that I wanted to hear in an interview. Yeah. Not only did it tell me that he had the experience selling, it told me that he wanted to sell it, yeah. And it told me that he could sell it. And it told me that he could sell, because he just sold me on the fact that he could sell it with a simple line that's like, what, 4 words? I can sell this. And I just, you know, of course he was hired and he went on to sell it.
Like, I was going to say,
yeah, he did. He did a great job. And it was just obvious with that one line, because there are so many times in interviews that, you know, there's one line out there that you could say that will get you the job, right? And he found that line. And yeah, it was a successful hire and a successful interview.
Confidence.
Yeah, it was all there in those 4 words, and I just thought it was perfect. And although I despise selling myself, if I ever have a sales interview, I'm going to use that line. These are happy successes. We're laughing. What about a rotten interview? Who's like one of the worst people you've ever interviewed? Not worst person, I guess worst interview subject, we'll say.
Well, and definitely when I'm facilitating workshops, I have shared this story before, but when I was hiring for a receptionist role, and I'd vetted all the resumes, and I had somebody that was on the top of the list. I thought, you know, pending a terrible interview, she's my gal. And so I'm interviewing her, and it's going really well, and it's just kind of confirming, okay, yes, yes, yes. And I say to her, why'd you leave your last job? And she launches into this story about her boss. And she was a big old bee, and I said this, and I was sitting there like, did you just swear in an interview and throw your old boss under the bus? And it was like a detailed, and I think I just sat there, Mike, like, I was stunned. And inside, I'm thinking, you get that I'm the boss, right? Like, now I'm worried that if I hire you, I'm going to be the person that you're, you know, telling a terrible story about down the road. And so I just was like, this is too big of a red flag to ignore. And of course, I didn't hire her. And normally in an interview, one question isn't a deal breaker, right? I look at the kind of average, but in this situation, it was such a red flag. She left. I called her because I call everyone I interview and said, you know, it's not you. And she asked me for feedback, and I did tell her. I said, don't ever let a bad past experience. I don't know about this employer or this person, but even if they were the worst boss in the world, you're not talking about that in an interview. Let that go, and don't let that bad past influence a positive future. I think she really took it in. She apologized, and I'm guessing moving forward, she never said that as the answer to why'd you leave your last job
It's
again.
a hard question to answer, right?
Yeah,
Like,
you gotta really.
when you think about it,
Yeah.
all jobs end bad, right? Like, well, most jobs,
Yeah.
I'll say. Most
Yeah.
jobs end bad, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's tough.
Learning that skill to smooth it over, and you can sort of say it without saying it and be subtle to show that you have discretion, and that's always what I kind of encourage people to do. And yeah, what about you? You had any bad interviews?
I've had a few, and the one that kind of sticks out in my mind, again, back in the journalism days, we would hire summer students a lot, right? And so we do a lot of interviews with young people for those positions. They were desirable positions back when journalism was a thing. And I can just remember interviewing this one young lady who, well, first off, everybody's nervous in interviews, but this was another level of nervousness that I actually thought it was fear. And I felt as an interviewer that because it was me and another man doing the interview of a young girl, I had felt that we had scared the heck out of her or something. And, there was nothing that we did. It was just the standard, you kind of say the same thing at the start of every interview. But I can just recall her trembling in fear, not having answers to any of the questions, barely even understanding the questions due to nerves. And it was, like I say, everybody's nervous in interviews, but this was to the extreme that I took away a feeling of guilt for just kind of going through the steps of whatever an interview is. And, I know that interviews can be difficult, and I hope that this young lady's kind of overcome some of those concerns or fears that she had. But I almost, I think she was crying at some point. And these were just like standard questions that we were asking. But I'll always remember that, so, I've kind of adapted my interview style a bit since, and I've always made sure that now that there's at least two people of different genders in the room, right? Because there's always the chance that maybe that was the intimidating element of it. But that sticks out in my mind as the worst interview. And I feel bad even talking about it, right? But, hey, so it goes.
We talk to folks about, plan to be nervous and have that strategy, but you got to be able to perform through the nerves so they can meet you.
Yeah.
And that it is kind of sad, but I'm sure you did everything you could.
Yeah, I appreciate your vote of confidence in me there. And we've been interviewed a lot too.
Yeah.
Tell me about your best interview performance.
I'm pretty good at interviews, Mike.
Yeah.
I'm lucky because I am verbal. That's my sort of learning style, and I can usually say what I think. I think my best interview was an interview I did at a place that I'd volunteered first. So when you have already kind of a foot in the door and you're a little bit known, or even when you get a kind of a recommendation or a referral, it feels a little different. Right? You're coming in with a tiny bit of an advantage, and you kind of know the organization and a few people, so it takes the pressure off a bit. And you really can organize yourself because you know some of the insider information around the organization. So I had an interview that was booked. They wanted me to do a talking portion, and then they wanted me to do an actual presentation because I was applying to be a facilitator. And so I, because it felt like more of a conversation because these were people I saw, a couple times a week for the last several months. And I just really gave them, again, a lot of stories, a lot of examples, tried to bring it to life. And then I created a presentation because what I had noticed and volunteering there was a few gaps in some of their content. So I thought, I'm going to design something that if I'm hired, I'm going to be able to use. And so my style is more interactive and engaging. So I'm thinking if I'm presenting as if I would to clients, I'm going to do the same thing. And it turned into this super interesting conversation. And I knew in the moment when they were like, well, what about that? I engaged them in my presentation. I thought, I'm getting this job. And I did.
And you did. And you did.
Yeah, what about you?
You know, we talk often about targeting resumes. I felt that this was a targeted interview, and you know, there's a lot of serendipity or luck that surrounds it. I had just published my own music-centered magazine, and tried to kind of solicit a bunch of advertisers. This is when I was living in the Waterloo-Kitchener area. And there was a job posting for someone to solicit advertisers for a music-based magazine. So this was like a perfect overlay of what I had just spent about 3 months doing. And I remember I went into the interview, and the publisher of the weekly was like, you know, kind of what makes you think you're qualified for this job? And I handed him the magazine that I had just published like 2 weeks before and said, look, this is exactly what you're doing, and this is, you know, it's full of ads, and, you know, I can get these same advertisers into your magazine. Wow. You know, and it was probably the shortest interview of my life. Yeah. It was kind of like, can you start today? And it worked out pretty well, because that advertising manager story I told earlier is from the same publication where I went on to be the manager, et cetera, and hire people in the same situation. So that was a good situation. But I've had many bad interviews too.
All right, let's hear one.
There's, I don't want to name any names. And actually, I've kind of heard a good number of our clients say the same type of idea to me in the past. The idea that, oh, it's not an interview, it's just a conversation. Well, there's a relatively big tech company here in London that had called me in for a conversation. So I prepared for a conversation, not a job interview. Right. So to prepare for a conversation, whatever, you think about it for 2 seconds while you're brushing your teeth that day. I did not know what their product was. I did not know how their business worked. I did not know the names of anyone who worked there. I kind of just didn't even really know why I was there, because they said, come on in, we want to talk to you. Right? Not come on in, we want to interview you. Come on, or not come on in, there's a job available that you might be qualified for. It was strictly, come on in, we want to talk to you. And I just took it completely the wrong way, and I never will again. That if I'm ever in that situation, it is an interview. Yeah. And it's almost like you have to treat every conversation with some employer that you don't work for as a job interview. Like, they didn't want to talk to me about my thoughts on baseball, or, they wanted to potentially hire me, and I had no idea. So I was super embarrassed after they said, well, you need to meet the CEO. Right? And again, it was the same spot. I said, like, meet the CEO. What are your likes and interests, dude? What'd you watch on TV last night? Like, it was a conversation, and I really screwed that one up. Yeah. What about you? You one ever go wrong for you?
Always perfect, no. Yeah, when I first came back from Toronto, I was looking around in London, and I had applied to the social service agency. I didn't know a ton about them. Probably didn't do as much research as I should have, kind of like similar to what you described. And I went in, and I was ready for the kind of most common questions, but they use a lot of technology with their clients, and so they asked me a lot of super technical questions. And I did my best, but I felt after I was kind of finished the talking portion of the interview that I was like, that was not my best work. And then they said to me, okay, so we're gonna have you go into this room and do some of the testing. And I was like, the testing? They were like, yeah, we're gonna have you do an Excel test and a typing test. And I was like, oh, and in the posting, they'd asked for Excel and keyboarding skills. And I was like, oh yes, I have those. And I do, but my Excel was kind of rusty. So my heart sunk. And I went into it, and I did the typing test well, and that Excel, I was like guessing at best. It was pretty bad, Mike. So I knew I wasn't getting that job. But you know what? They say if you lose, don't lose the lesson. Yeah. And the lesson in that for me was, when you get that call for the job interview, you gather as much information as you can about what that's gonna look like, right? How long, who are you gonna be talking to? Will there be any skill-based applications? Because I'm sure if I would have asked, they would have said, yeah, prepare for an Excel test. And I just didn't ask the question, and then was really not prepared. And I'm sure somebody else was that asked the question and got that job. So
Yeah, it's done for a lot of companies will hire the person and teach them the skills, but when you're when you're put on the spot to show the skills, you sure as heck better have them.
yeah,
Otherwise, yeah, you're kind of
yeah,
wasting everyone's time a bit.
yeah.
You know, something else to think about when you think about employment widely and performance in roles is management.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, who's the best manager you've ever had?
Well, I'm really lucky. I've had some really great managers. And I would say that the best manager I ever had is, he wasn't just my boss, he was like a real mentor for me, Mike. I was, again, kind of newer to social services, new to Toronto, had a lot to learn about just working in diverse communities. I was coming from London, which was not super diverse at the time. And so my learning curve was steep. And I felt like what he would always do, just without even being asked, is he would intuitively be kind of, everything he was doing, he was explaining why he was doing it. And so I was always learning, and his door was literally always open. And so he was just a guy that knew every client, that paid very close attention, and he trusted me. So I was, before I was even promoted into being, a supervisor, I could say yes at a community meeting, I could make decisions with clients, and he was just like, I trust that you're gonna problem solve, and if you make a mistake, we'll retool. And I loved that. So it allowed me to just be in this environment where he was like, get every learning opportunity you can. So my professional development was on tilt. I was, saying yes to all these opportunities for projects. I learned so much from him, right? We're still in touch. He's still a professional reference for me years later. And I'm just so lucky that I met somebody like that so early in my career, because later when I was a manager, again, I'm thinking, well, what would he do, right? And often, because I just really trusted and respected him so much, he role modeled for me what a really good manager looks like. Mm-hmm. Have you been that lucky too, Mike?
Well, I've also had a lot of great managers,
yeah.
But one who sticks out was this guy who was not touchy-feely in any way. Mm-hmm. He was mean, and he scared people. And
this is your best?
Yeah, for whatever reason, I responded very well to that. I found that a lot of people didn't respond well to it, but I did, because I knew exactly what he wanted. It made it very clear to me when I did something wrong, and he wasn't afraid to say when something was not what he was looking for or when something was wrong. And because of that, within weeks, I was perfect every time, because it was super clear what he wanted. And that, I've had a lot of great managers, but a lot of managers are really nice, really kind of supportive, and anything you need. He wasn't like that at all. I've talked to you in the past about how I don't respond well to positive feedback. I only respond well to negative feedback.
True.
Well, he was perfect for that, because he had no real positive feedback. It was all negative. But it just really ensured that my work was up to snuff. Like, he was a professional, and he knew what he wanted. And within weeks, my work was at his level. Wow. And, although he wasn't an intentional mentor, he certainly was. Yeah. And I guess the one other thing that I totally respected about him was that he never took credit for any work that got done. Even if it was work that he did, he would always make it clear who did it, or who made him look good, or who was kind of supporting him, right? And he would never truly blame people either when things went wrong, which is a classic thing. But I'll always appreciate his style. I hope I have another manager like him in the future. I hope that I can maybe be a gentler version of that manager for others too, because it can be tough to say no. It can be tough to say wrong, and he just knew how to do it in a take no prisoners, take no guff type of way, and it affected me a long time.
Yeah. Perfect manager for you.
Perfect manager for me.
Yeah.
Yes, and everybody's different, and every manager is different too. It sounds like he'd be a bad manager for you.
Maybe.
Maybe. Well, who was your worst manager?
My worst manager was someone who they came in from outside the organization. We got a new executive director, and she brought in her friend because she won some allies. But unfortunately, this person had never worked in social services, had never worked in a feminist organization, really didn't have any management experience. So it was more who she knew rather than what she knew. And she came in, which would have been okay, and all that can be learned if you got the right person, but she was super defensive. So she came in kind of expecting that we were going to be like, oh, you got the job because your friend hired you. So she kind of had this, like, her backup, right? Yeah. And she would say things sometimes that weren't accurate, but if you, kind of ask questions about it, she would get angry. Yeah. She would hide in her office, and it was in a women's shelter, so the women and kids are there 24/7. She didn't know any of their names or who they were. Yeah. And I get that managers need to be working on more high-level stuff, but if you really couldn't, come out to the kitchen every once in a while to introduce yourself, that's, to me, wasn't great. And it's funny because you used the term up to snuff recently. And I remember I was in her office once and I was saying, something wasn't up to snuff. And she said, "How dare you?" And I was like, "Pardon?" And she's like, "You can't say that. Like, do you even know what that means?" And I said, I think so. And she said, "Like snuff, like a snuff film. Like, that's not what we talk." And I was like, "What is how?" Like, I was just shocked, and it was just the most uncomfortable experience. And I could probably give you 100 stories in the year and a half that I worked with this woman before I got off the team, and everybody was looking for a way out, right? We loved our jobs, but we did not love reporting to this particular person because they just, weren't open to learning or, admitting that they made a mistake. And I think you role model that as a manager. Nobody's perfect, but being able to identify this. So that was probably my worst manager. It was pretty over the top, quite frankly. What about you?
Yeah, I worked with a guy who was always in a bad mood and clearly hated his job. And there's a real trickle down when your manager hates their job.
Yeah.
And I hated my job. And, it's just, if you're working with a miserable person who goes to great efforts to make themselves inaccessible, which sounds a bit like the person you just mentioned, right? Like, you couldn't talk to this manager about anything, and it was clear that every single day there were places he would have rather been. And, it just had a huge negative effect, and it didn't last long. And, I feel bad for anybody who's working for him now. All right, so I think widely about what you and I have done in our lives. I'm going to say I've had 15 jobs.
Yeah, same.
Is there like an overarching lesson or an observation that maybe you could pull out from those jobs and share with anybody who might still be watching this video 20 minutes in or wherever we're at now?
I suppose for me, it's about work has always been about relationship building, right? And the processes are important. And so I think a lot of people focus on just the bottom line, the outcome. Did we do it or did we not? And I think that sometimes you can reach the target or hit the outcome, but if you don't have thoughtful process and how you get there, it can do a lot of damage. So including people in conversations and projects, in consulting with people that have expertise in whatever you're kind of creating or developing, and then ultimately just building those allies at work. When I'm new in a job, I'm looking for the champions. Who are people that I can learn from, who will help support me, who, I just want to have always people inside my organization that help me get better, learn the work, help. I've always worked in social services, and so sometimes when you're supporting somebody that has really complex needs, you can't figure it out all by yourself. You need to or even just debrief after a difficult conversation, et cetera. So for me, I want to learn from the people that are already there and really just sort of kind of emulate that and learn from them. So for me, building strong relationships at work is everything. What about you? What's your...
I would say it's kind of a karma-based idea in that if you put your best foot forward with everything you do, things will kind of work out in your favor in the end. That's every interaction with every coworker, that's every element of your job, that's every interaction with management, clients, customers, whatever it might be. Just always put your best foot forward and be confident that that's going to come around in that kind of karma way. And, you know, maybe I've been exceptionally lucky in my employment career, but I've tried to put my best foot forward every day in every job I've had ever since that first guy that I mentioned, who was the same guy every day. And things have, you know, I've been happy. You know, I've been happy, and I think part of it is because I am always trying to do my best. I'm never second guessing myself. So if I had one piece of advice for young people or people starting new jobs, is just put your best foot forward. Never say no. Say yes and try to do your best. And those things kind of snowball and snowball and snowball, and then you kind of get addicted to doing as well as you can. And you know, that's, I guess, my lesson from 30 years of employment, we'll say.
And I think you walk the walk. You know, if that's your advice, I see you do that.
Yeah, that's nice
in the work
to
you
say.
do. So, yeah, it was nice chatting with you today,
Yeah,
Mike.
that was good. That was fun. We should do this again sometime.
Absolutely.